I'm Tom Moller. This is the 94.7 FM The Word Book Club, and I'm really happy to interview what you said in your. I have to do this. Bob Beltz, who wrote the book The Solomon Syndrome, which we'll be telling you about, but he autographed it to me, to Tom, my old friend. Thank you, Bob. Underlined old, and put a big smiley face. So
there we go.
That was nice.
That's right.
Now,
we've known each other a few years.
We have, and I am so glad that in this early phase of what we're doing with this video, like you and I talked about, I'm a radio guy. This is a new medium. Now you're used to, video stuff, and
I don't know if you ever get real used to it, but you've. I think, as my wife said to you, she's was a big fan of yours, so she's listened to you for years. So
over on KNUS.
So anyway,
well, it's good to have you.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And it's really good. This is Dr. Bob Beltz. He is the author of The Solomon Syndrome, a blueprint for a more meaningful and happy life. I read it.
Good.
I didn't just.
Are you happier? No.
Yeah, because it works, and therefore that's why you should buy it. In your own words, I have read it, but rather than me characterize what it's all about, in your own words, tell us what the Solomon Syndrome is all about.
Well, I'll give you a little bit of background. For many years, my good friend Bo Mitchell, who you also know, and I did men's retreats, and primarily with kind of young businessmen, oftentimes that really didn't have a spiritual background, oftentimes, pretty successful, but with success in terms of how or how our culture views it. Sometimes that came at the cost of family, marriages, some of the things that are really more important in life. And as we would do these retreats, we would tend to zero in on certain area of relationships and try and help communicate the importance of that priority. And so at a point in time, I felt like I wanted to try and get that concept into print, so I started working on the book. And actually, I think I've written a number of things, and there are different motivations, but one of the things that was behind this book was I wanted my kids, when they grew up, to know what were the things that made me tick. And so that was a big motivation behind it. The Solomon Syndrome itself, which is the name of the book, is actually the problem. It's not the solution.
Right.
And again, looking at oftentimes the groups of men that we were working with, they were focused in on things like, increasing wealth, more possessions, power or prestige. I spent some time, as you know, working on some film projects in Hollywood, and there it's all about fame, but the reality is that the way that I believe we were created and what the scriptures talk about in terms of how to have a more meaningful and significant life, and even happy. I've been teaching the Beatitudes, and that first word that's usually translated blessed in our English versions, the real meaning of the word in the Greek is happy, so it's a true happiness. So, Solomon, to me, in the book of Ecclesiastes, was like the first modern man, because he really goes through every one of the, I would say, values that our culture teaches us is how to have a good and a happy life, and reaches the goals at a level that few of us, if any of us, would ever achieve. And yet, as he assessed one by one those accomplishments, of course, he would reflect and say, meaningless. meaningless. It's meaningless. So Solomon syndrome sort of represents where many people are stuck in culture. And what the book tries to do then is to demonstrate, well, how did God design us to have a truly significant and meaningful life, which really revolves more around relationships and those kinds of things. So that was sort of the background behind the book.
Now, you originally published the book 20 years ago.
Yes.
And so obviously you've updated it now.
Yes, and a lot's happened in those 20 years, as you know in the book. One is that my wife developed Alzheimer's, and so for 7 years I was her primary caregiver, and she passed away several years ago, and God brought an old friend back into my life that I'd actually known for 38 years. This is Joy, my wife, and we fell in love and got married, and so a lot of new chapters, in a sense, in life. But just having gone through, seeing my kids grow up and going through that, it felt like it was maybe time to refresh it. And I think the message is timeless. So again, to try and get it out that people could access it, that after that first version had gone out of print.
In the intervening years, I always like to kind of get behind the writing on the pages.
Yeah.
In that 20-year period, with all that's taken place in your life, and then the rewrite. How has that 20 years changed your perspective, or it hasn't?
Well, I think it's probably deepened it more than anything. And, I was younger, obviously, when both we were doing retreats. And of course, in your 30s, you sort of think you've got the whole thing figured out and mastered. But I would say that because the principles that are in the book, and really kind of digging into, what do the scriptures say should be the priorities of our life. I would say that if anything, it's not only more relevant to me today than it was when I wrote it, but almost at every level there's a depth that perhaps wasn't there in my own life when I first wrote it. So if anything, the intervening years have, reaffirmed to me the truth of what the book tackles.
Do you ever write something fully convinced about it, and then you go back and reread it and go, wow, that's good? I'm surprised by what came out of your own hand.
I have that experience, oftentimes if I'm back and reading through something that I've written and I thought, I don't think I'm smart enough to have come up with that.
Yeah.
So, I've always, felt like that, God was involved in the process, and particularly if you're dealing with subjects that, that have to do with scripture. And it's like, I'm not sure I could write that today.
Yeah,
so
right.
Anyway.
Right. You draw in the book some parallels between King Solomon.
Yes.
And the name of the book is The Solomon Syndrome. And some parallels between King Solomon, James Dean, Humphrey Bogart, and Marilyn Monroe. Now, I'm an old guy. I remember James Dean, Humphrey Bogart, Marilyn Monroe. Full disclosure, I'm 78 years old. I'm on the eve of 79. And those parallels are striking.
Well, again, you're looking at people that have accomplished, fame, fortune, all of the things that, again, that I think our culture tells us make us successful. And, the book, actually, early in the book, I talk about the fact that I can remember seeing this, first of all, seeing this painting by an artist named Heldwine. That was an old diner scene at night, and inside the diner it had these famous characters. I think Elvis was even in there, maybe behind the counter as serving or whatever. Didn't realize at the time that it was sort of a spin-off or a takeoff on a very famous painting by Edward Hopper called Nighthawks, that shows this diner scene late at night, and a number of people at the counter, and again being waited on. And there's sort of a not a despair, but there's a darkness to that original painting. And this other artist took that concept and then took these well-known, famous people, and part of what they all had in common was that they seemed to have tragic endings. And he named the painting Boulevard of Broken Dreams, which then is a theme, of course, that also traces through the book, that at some point in time, you need to get off the Boulevard of Broken Dreams. And again, I think that the belief system behind what that painting represented was really reflected in the life of Solomon. So, he was, again, Solomon was such a great example of what you don't want to invest your life in. That the publishers said, well, let's use that as the title on the book, which is again actually what you don't want to do. So so I think that's where the parallels came in.
Hence the word syndrome.
Yes. Right. And it has to do a lot, and in the book, just because I think I spent so much time working and teaching with guys like you, that that it helps if you have a simple picture.
True.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of graphics in the book, but one of them really has to do with what makes us tick, and we all have certain needs, deep needs in our life, and those needs then tend to influence our belief system. And what the Solomon Syndrome was, well, it was a belief system that, again, believed that power and and wealth and possessions, that those are the things that will meet those needs. And what happens is that out of our belief system, we tend to then act, and most of our actions, whether we are aware of it or not, at some level tend to be rooted in some very deep belief systems. And those belief systems then, and the action is going to lead to one of two consequences. One is it's going to meet the needs deep in our life, or the second is that it's going to lead us down the Boulevard of Broken Dreams. So that's kind of where that ties together too.
My guest is Bob Beltz, who is the author of The Solomon Syndrome, a blueprint for a more meaningful and happy life. And I go back many years. I enjoyed the men's Bible study every, I think, Tuesday morning. In fact, I've got to tell you about that. I was coming back from a business trip in New York City, forgot to change my watch one Tuesday morning. I was so excited to get back in town. And I showed up at the church for this men's Bible study with 200-300 guys.
Right.
Attended it, and I was.
You were the first one there.
I was.
or were you the last one there? Huh?
Well, let me see. Spring forward. I was the first one there. We talk about what you've been experiencing with all of the things in life, with pastoring and writing and movies and so forth. In this book, The Solomon Syndrome, you cover a lot of ground that how-to books cover, but the how-to books don't mention the missing ingredient, which is the power that Jesus brings into a man's life to accomplish the how-to.
Right, and there's a couple of things that I think make the book unique. We'll get to that. I'll go back to that one too. The other is that there's a tendency to isolate each of these areas of relationship, particularly because ultimately the book is about having relational priorities instead of cultural priorities. And I think that what I was struck by is nobody took all of the variety of those relationships and showed how do they fit together. And so the book does cover a lot of ground, because it's not just a book on marriage or a book on family or friendships. It's really tries to attempt to show how all those things were intended to fit together, again, into a more relational kind of a lifestyle. And ultimately, when you begin to look at the relationships, I think there's a hierarchy there in Scripture. And of course, when Jesus was asked, what's the greatest commandment, which I always tried to explain to our guys, it's like I've got this monstrous book, and frankly, there's no way I'm ever going to figure out everything that's in here. So what's most important? Which I think is kind of the question that Jesus was being asked when he was asked what's the greatest commandment. And of course, he then goes on to quote both Deuteronomy and Leviticus and says, the greatest commandment is to love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And then the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. So when you begin to look at relational priorities, it's, again, there's kind of a sequence, and that spiritual dimension is really the thing that holds it all together. And so the highest, priority of our relational life should be that relationship with God.
At the end of each chapter are reflections that you take the reader on for the reader to assess his own life.
Right.
And there is a progression of that to the goal of the book, fulfillment of the blueprint for a more meaningful and happy life.
Yes, and the book is, it probably, I don't know how many people that read it even pick up on this, but the book is divided into two really big sections. And the first part of the book I call assessment, which is to get some kind of an understanding on what is my personal belief system, how do I fit into this, and to be able to take a look at your own life and assess. Then the second half of the book I called adjustment. So I go back in then and again take each of these areas of relationship and try and give some tips or some hints on how can you improve this particular part of your life. And so I was trying to balance both, kind of identify the problem and then what's the solution, and what can I do, simple things, what can I do to get my life back into alignment with where it should be.
Were you thinking of non-Christians when you wrote this, or Christians when you wrote this, or
when you write a book, the publisher is always asking you, well, who's the audience? And I always have a hard time with that, because I tend to probably, speak and write to a pretty mixed group. And as you know, Cherry Hills Community Church was a pretty mixed group.
Yeah.
You had some people that, were long-term and solid in terms of their faith, and it happened to be the kind of a place that would always attract what some people would call seekers, but folks that really weren't sure about where they were in their spiritual lives. And so when I write, oftentimes I'm kind of thinking about both of those groups, which I'm not sure you're supposed to if you're a writer, but I tend to. But the interesting thing is that I probably have had more positive feedback and response from people that either aren't people of faith or people that have kind of moved away from their faith than even those that are believers and probably know most of this but have never put it all together. I have a friend that's a missionary in Africa for 40 years, and he said, it's not so much that you said anything new there, but he said it was the way you put it together that made it unique. And we gave a copy to one of our neighbors down the street that we're friends with, but as far as we knew, really weren't quite sure where they were spiritually. And they came back to us and said, could I have another copy of that, because I have a friend that's going through a rough time in her marriage, and I really think this would be helpful. And that was very encouraging, because again, it spoke to me that that the book is something that someone that isn't let's say, more religious could identify with. And of course, that's why I used so many illustrations from pop culture, like you were talking about, because I felt like that would tie these concepts into something that perhaps people were more familiar with.
Yeah, I really appreciated the illustrations from pop culture, and also really appreciated the testimonies that range throughout the book. Both testimonies from Scripture and testimonies from people responding to Scripture or not responding to Scripture. But as I read the book, it is a direct, powerful means of evangelism for somebody who would take the time and the seriousness to consider all the things because you start from where we all are in the world with the world's concepts and the world's values. And if we're serious about our life, I think you alluded to the fact in the book that you were once sort of hippie-ish. Is that correct?
Well, I wasn't a hippie because I liked to take showers, and but I was probably a pretty normal college student, in the late '60s. So, I had certainly embraced a lot of that value system. But I always kind of laugh about the fact because I couldn't have been a hippie because I like taking a shower every day, So, but anyway, I had, that was my background.
Yeah.
I was actually, 21 years old when I first understood what it meant to have a relationship with Christ and opened my life, to that. So I had a little bit of background that was, different for sure.
Haven't we all? But we all start from drinking from the culture, and I think that the book can be really, really helpful for somebody who really wants to seriously look at their life with the idea of meaning and happiness, and of course, Jesus has got to come along with that. Otherwise, it's an empty concept.
Yeah, and one of the things, and there's several places in the book where I go back to this, but one of the things that I think someone that's not a believer, might ask is, well, why do I need that? I'm of the conviction that when you read Scripture, that we were created to be three-dimensional beings. That we're not only physical, beings, obviously, and emotional beings, but that we were really created that at the core of who we are, that the presence of God would be there in terms of a spiritual dimension to our lives. And what's happened, in the fall, as the book of Genesis kind of lays it out for us, is that there was a break that took place in that relationship with God, and that part of that was that what I think was actually the presence of the Spirit in our life at the point of creation, that spiritually we became dead. Now we're alive physically, and I think we're born alive physically, spiritually dead, because something's missing in our life, and that's a big part of why Jesus, constantly was kind of pointing back to the fact that, that I'm the way, the truth, and the life, and I've come that you might have life more abundantly. And oftentimes he actually uses a different word for life than we use, than in the Greek world, at least, the word for physical life and the word for spiritual life. There's two different words there. And Jesus was constantly talking about, the need for that spiritual dimension, because without it, and again, I think sometimes existentially what we experience is sort of a feeling like something's missing, and that's true, apart from Christ coming and again, the spiritual part of our life coming alive when we invite Jesus to come into our lives. So people are people that don't have that are really living a two-dimensional life in what was intended to be a three-dimensional, reality. So,
and that also can apply to the Christian who long ago received Jesus Christ into his life, but he, at least my observation is, many do not draw from the spiritual aspect of their life, though they may be a Christian in name.
Well, and in other books, I've also talked about the fact that, that there really are three kinds of people in the world. And Paul talks about this in Corinthians, and he talks about the natural man, and he actually uses a word there that deals with being alive physically. And then he talks about the spiritual man or woman who has, come alive spiritually. And then he talks about a third person, and it's a funny, actually in the Greek, the word has, the root of it is sarx, which was the Greek word for flesh. And it not only meant flesh and bone, but it also talked about that old nature that had, that we develop apart from, the influence of Christ in our life. And it's as if, you start out and Jesus is outside your life and ego is enthroned. So ego's in control. And then if you come to that point of understanding who Jesus is and open your life to him, it's as if you dethrone ego and enthrone Christ so that he's really the one that's in the driver's seat or in control. And if those were the only two possibilities, we would all be in a lot better shape, I think, because the third possibility, and this is what Paul is talking about when he, in that text, is that even with Christ in our life, I think on a regular basis, our tendency is to dethrone Christ and re-enthrone ego. And he says, aren't you acting just like mere men? In other words, it's possible to have Christ in your life and for it not to look any different than the guy down the block that's never even heard about him. And so the challenge, I think, in our spiritual lives on a daily basis is trying to make sure that Christ is the one that's enthroned, ruling kind of at the core of our being, and that ego is dethroned. And then when we become aware that we've switched that and that we've taken, back control back over, simply to stop and to pray and, and to ask Christ to take control again. I think there's a lot of believers out there that don't understand that. And consequently, once ego has taken back over, they might spend the rest of their lives with Christ in their life, but really with ego the thing that's controlling them. And the result is they won't experience what we're talking about in this book. And that's why that spiritual dimension is so important.
And I asked that question and noted that, what you just noted, to kind of piggyback on my earlier statement that this is really a great process that a person really hunting for what only Christ can give, who doesn't have Christ in his life. But it's also a great process for the kind of person that you just described, a person who has removed the throne of Jesus, though Jesus is kind of hovering in the corner of his life. Or, for that matter, we all, from time to time, sort of remove it for a moment, maybe, and take him back. So all of the things that you say at the end of each chapter where people can assess their own life can really help a Christian tighten up his relationship.
Yeah, I hope so. Because again, the intention is to, first of all, identify the fact that where we're off course, which periodically we tend to do, and then to know, well, how do I get back on course? And I think for the person you're talking about, that might, have had a relationship or has some kind of relationship, but still their life is much more self-controlled. than ego controlled versus Christ controlled. Hopefully as they look at the way things are supposed to be, let's put it that way, that it can be a little bit of a wake-up call.
Yeah. The book is The Solomon Syndrome, a blueprint for a more meaningful and happy life. And whether you're a Christian, whether you're not a Christian, whether you have somebody in mind that you say, wow, this book can really help them, you brought some books for us to give away.
Yeah, and I'm happy to do that, to get it into people's hands. So, yeah.
So here's what you can do. Until what you brought are already given away, whatever the amount is, email me at tom@krks.com and just say that you would like a copy of the book. I'll confirm that and then tell you how you can come to the station and pick up the copy. But if you would like to buy the book, instead of just kind of snarf up a free one here, where is the book available?
Well, the easiest way is Amazon.
Okay.
And actually, the easiest way to find it on Amazon is to go to bobbeltz.com.
Okay.
And my son set up that website, which has access to both the teaching videos that we've done, but it also has a link for books. And if you hit that, it'll immediately take you into Amazon where all of my books are. And so Amazon's an easy way to get it. Secondly, if you have a bookstore that that you do business at and like to buy from, they can order it and get it for you. Okay. So it's available either place.
And Beltz is spelled B-E-L-T-Z, bobbeltz.com. Bob, I really appreciate your coming in and talking about it. And let's make a time when you get this other one published and in. Let's do it again.
I'd love to do that because it's a novel and it's fun and it has a story and it ties into an earlier book, as we said. So
what I ought to do is to read the earlier book then.
I'll get you a copy of that.
You got a deal.
Okay, great.
Thank you for being with us.
Well, thanks for having me.